A few weeks ago, I came out with this video where I talked about what I call the restoration hardware lore, more specifically, the CEO Gary Friedman's lore. And if I've learned anything after creating that initial video, it's that there really is a mountain of lore, a luxury mountain of lore, if you will. But if you don't get that reference, you will by the end of this episode. And I've also learned something since coming out with that video. Many people feel quite strongly about Gary. I'm Sammi Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two. Hello, and welcome back to Social Currency. Today's episode is one of the most requested episodes that I have ever received. Hundreds of you have sent me messages about the company since that episode went live. Some of you are previous employees of RH, some are competitors, and some are everything in between. But before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. Everything you're about to hear is based on publicly available information and reflects my personal opinions and analysis. So it should not be taken as fact beyond what's been publicly reported. And it's definitely not investment advice. This podcast is not affiliated with or sponsored by any company that I'm mentioning. And while everything is accurate to the best of my knowledge at the time of recording, facts may change after publication. Now that that's out of the way, there is a ton that I couldn't get into in the shorter form social video on my Instagram. So that's obviously why I have a podcast. And this restoration hardware topic is so vast, and there are so many elements that I want to talk about. There was no way that I could fit it all into one measly episode. So we're going to do this in a two-part series, and this episode today is part one. This is more of the backstory and the context of restoration hardware / RH, so you feel like you know what's going on before we get into part two. So we're going to talk a lot about the history and Gary's earlier days at the company. Now, part two will come out on Tuesday, and we're going to pull back the curtain on how the company may not be all that it seems to be. And the man behind it all, Gary Friedman, is part visionary, part provocateur, and part illusionist. He is the CEO who took a bankrupt furniture company and convinced Wall Street that it was building the LVMH of America. And for a while, everyone believed him. So this is the story of how RH has gotten to where it is today and why the view from the top of Luxury Mountain may not be what it seems. So grab your drink of choice, depending on the time of day that you're listening. That might be a coffee, because this is a juicy one. It might just be a cocktail. This is water. And let's get into it. The restoration hardware story begins way before Gary Friedman actually comes in. To start, we're going to need to go back a few decades, so let's go back to 1979. Stephen Gordon is the person who actually came up with restoration hardware to begin with. And he was based in Eureka, California, and he buys a crumbling Victorian house and he wants to restore it. He needs antique fixtures in order to do this properly. So door knockers, brass handles, light fixtures, stuff like that. And he can't find them anywhere. So he starts calling antique dealers, marking up their items and selling them through a makeshift catalog. He nails a sign outside of his home that says Restoration Hardware, and boom, the brand is born. So for years, Restoration Hardware was a small, quirky retail chain selling home goods, nostalgia, and random Americana tchotchkes. Now, Stephen was able to scale the company, and by 1998, he actually takes the company public. They had 47 stores at that point, and by the end of that year, their store footprint expands to 65. The company was not being run exceptionally well at all, so by 2001, the company's stock had dropped to $1. They were out of cash, out of direction, and on the verge of bankruptcy. And that is when Gary Friedman shows up to save the day. So Gary Friedman's story is retail folklore. In many ways, it's really a rags to riches story. Now, his father passed away when Gary was just 5 years old, and his mom was mentally ill, so he did not have a very stable upbringing. He goes to a local community college, but he actually drops out while he is working as a store employee at the Gap in San Francisco. So his first role at Gap was literally folding jeans and stacking sweaters. And one day, one very fateful day, the CEO of Gap at the time, his name was Mickey Drexler. If you've heard of him, he is a retail legend in his own right. And he walks into Gary's store and asks the floor a question. And Gary, who was this kid from the stockroom, answers it, and he answers it correctly. And Mickey Drexler is really impressed with him. He is so impressed that he actually calls Gary the next day and asks him to come into a meeting at Gap's headquarters with all of the Gap's top executives. And Mickey asks 21-year-old Gary at the time to tell them what was happening at the company. And Gary's career accelerated very quickly from there. And soon he's promoted to district manager, then regional manager, and he oversees 63 stores. Gary rises through the ranks and eventually he moves over over to Williams-Sonoma. And just like at the Gap, he moves up through the ranks very quickly. It's clear that throughout his career, Gary is a visionary in retail, and he understands how to create products that customers actually want to buy. He then spends 13 years at Williams-Sonoma, where he took Pottery Barn from a $50 million tableware business to a $1 billion plus furniture brand. And eventually, due to all of the incredible work that he's done at Williams-Sonoma as president and COO, he's promised the CEO role. But when it's time for that promotion, the board passes over him. And the CEO of Williams-Sonoma tells him to not get emotional about the fact that he's passed over, since he has a $50 million stock option waiting for him. And after that conversation, legend has it that he's walking home and he sees a billboard in San Francisco that says, "He who dies with the most toys is still dead." And that is the line that gives him the confidence to move on to the next challenge. So in March of 2001, after 14 years at Williams-Sonoma, Gary resigned and took over the reins of Restoration Hardware, a company with its stock at an all-time low and teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. Gary raised $15 million, $4.5 million was his own money, to infuse into Restoration Hardware so that the company wouldn't go into bankruptcy. Gary's immediate prognosis of the business was poor merchandising. Gary really does turn the company around. So by 2004, they have their first profitable year, but the following year, the business stalls again. And I want to take a quick pause because I want to mention a pretty wild true crime slate of events that happened right around this time period. While he was leading Restoration Hardware, Gary was allegedly dating someone who used to work at Restoration Hardware, but had since moved on to another company called Red Envelope. Now, the woman's name was Ashlyn Dyer, and on March 2nd, 2006, Ashlyn was struck by a vehicle in a hit and run at 7 a.m. in San Francisco. And she ended up passing away, and they never found out who did it. I really want to make sure this comes across in the right way, but so many people reached out to me about this situation, ranging from family members to friends of Ashlyn after I came out with the initial RH video on social media. So I'm mentioning the story solely with the hopes that one day they're able to find out who is responsible. And because the situation happened around this time period, and clearly a lot of time has passed, it felt right to mention it at this point in the story. Okay, so that is an aside. Going back to RH, in June 2008, Catterton Partners comes in and takes the company private. So while everyone else was panicking about the economy, Gary doubles down on his vision. The recession hits, consumer spending tanks, and what does he do? He raises prices. He kills off all of those cheap trinket-like items that got people in the door. This isn't about surviving the downturn. This was about transformation. Think about it. Back in '98, Restoration Hardware wasn't going after households making $75,000. Whereas in 2012, they come out to say in their S1 filing that they're targeting households making $200,000. And to really drive home that they'd left their old identity behind, they even dropped Restoration Hardware from their name and they officially rebrand to RH. Over time, Gary develops this luxury mountain metaphor. And on this mountain, it's where the luxury brands reside. And he talks about how RH will climb this mountain too in order to be a true best-in-class luxury brand. And so they decide to do something pretty smart with their supply chain in order to get there. They cut out the middleman and they go straight to the manufacturers. And this wasn't just about saving money, although that did help. It gave them real visibility into how things were made and let them work directly with these suppliers to ramp up production when needed. And here's the thing. A lot of these manufacturers were small, family-run operations, so that partnership approach was really crucial. And now what made RH different from other furniture retailers was that they weren't designing products from scratch. They'd find these beautiful, well-made pieces that were already being produced and basically say, we want to sell that too. Then they'd work with the manufacturer to scale it up because most of these small firms didn't have the capital or the retail know-how to supply a major chain on their own. And they also completely reimagined their catalog strategy too. And so this has gotten a ton of press, but instead of churning out these thin under 100-page catalogs, they start creating what they call source books. And these things are massive. We're talking multi-100-page books, sometimes hitting 1,000 pages. And in 2014, they famously sent out a 17-pound source book, which received a ton of backlash from customers and non-customers alike. And over time, the whole approach has shifted. Now, maybe they send one or two of these hefty books per year. store. And they've tweaked the formula over time, adjusted the length, the frequency, eventually split them up by product line, and there are different ones for their modern line, outdoor, teen, etc. But they're still putting out these substantial glossy books that are hundreds of pages long. And these source books became essential to their direct business model. It's how they reach customers beyond their physical stores. The books do double duty. People can order directly from them, but they also work as this high-end advertising piece that drives people into the stores. It's marketing and sales channel all in one. And in 2011, they made another bold move. They started opening these massive gallery stores. They wanted to move away from mall locations squeezed between other retailers. These new full-line design galleries were standalone destinations, about 3 times bigger at over 21,000 square feet. They launched the first 2 in Houston and LA, and the results were pretty incredible. In their 2012 IPO filing, they say that the LA gallery boosted in-store demand by 85% and even drove their direct business up 30%. Think about the timing here. This is when everyone else in retail was freaking out about e-commerce and planning to shrink their physical store footprint. RH did the exact opposite. They went bigger and more expensive, which ironically ended up working in their favor. Now, they weren't just blindly expanding everywhere, though. They let dozens of leases expire on those old mall stores, so their total store count actually dropped to 71 by the end of 2012. But these stores that they were opening were way more ambitious and had a completely different feel. This was the beginning of their second transformation. They just returned to profitability in 2011, and that's when they decide to go public again. So RH goes public in 2012, and their market cap hit roughly $850 million, nearly 5 times what they had been taken private for just 4 years earlier. But here's where it gets messy. Right before the roadshow, which is the name of the process for when a company goes around to different institutional investors to generate interest and demand for the IPO, the board found out that Gary had been in a consensual relationship with a 26-year-old female employee, and he resigns as co-CEO. He didn't disappear, though. He stuck around with the title chairman, creator, and curator and kept steering the ship. And a year later, he was back as co-CEO, and by 2014, he was sole CEO. And after the IPO, they kept pushing the store concept further. At first, it was about showing more products and creating these elevated, curated spaces. Then they start going to extremes to stand out. Gary had this whole philosophy about it. He said their goal was to transform the traditional retail model from a way to shop to a way to live. He would talk about how most malls are these archaic, windowless boxes lacking any sense of humanity. His line was, "We don't want to change the face of retail, but rather give it a soul." So the strategy became move into these unique, oversized locations that would generate buzz and become destinations on their own. Not just places to buy furniture, but places that people actually wanted to visit. And around this time, RH was trying to define itself as more than just a furniture company. They wanted to go into verticals that lived beyond the home. They create a vertical called RH Music and create an art gallery called RH Contemporary Art. The RH Music concert at the Greek Theater in Berkeley had concert goers sitting on the brand's luxury furniture. Now, the music vertical and the art gallery were short-lived, but they remind us of how Gary wanted to solidify the brand as a lifestyle type of experience. And 2014 was when they unveiled what they called their next generation gallery in Atlanta. This thing was massive, 43,000 square feet to be exact. And to put that into perspective, that is nearly twice the size of their typical big stores, which they'd started calling large format galleries. These weren't just big spaces. They were in architecturally stunning buildings that reinforced the upscale image that they were building. Now, here's the counterintuitive part. Making their stores bigger actually improved their negotiating position with landlords. They were targeting these iconic standalone buildings, often in parts of the cities that were looking for revitalization. Property owners saw the value in having RH bring crowds to the area. Plus, RH was getting creative with their layouts, using rooftops, gardens, outdoor areas, which meant that their actual selling space cost less per square foot than traditional retail. And the economics worked out better than expected. They were paying about 20% less per square foot than they'd projected. And these new locations were paying for themselves in 12 to 18 months instead of the 20 months that they'd seen before. Lower construction costs plus strong sales made the math work. The scale of these galleries turned them into attractions rather than just stores. People would make a trip specifically to visit them. And that freed RH up from needing prime mall real estate, which is typically expensive. When they did set up shop near a shopping center, it was often because the landlord was offering them incentives to bring customers to the area. These massive new spaces gave them room room to experiment. And in 2015, they decided to try something different. They added restaurants to the galleries. And the Chicago location was the guinea pig. They positioned the restaurant right in the heart of the building, which was a genius idea from a design perspective. Anyone coming to dinner had to walk through the furniture displays to get to their table. And after eating, people would naturally wander around exploring the space, even if buying furniture wasn't on their agenda for the day. They had to be able to turn a furniture shopping experience, which usually happens once every few years, if that, into something that would organically happen whenever you had a dinner reservation at the store's restaurant. It was very strategic to not put the restaurant on the first floor because they always want people to have to walk through the store's showrooms in order to eventually get to the restaurant. And about a year into the restaurant experiment, Gary shared some numbers on their earnings call in Q3 2015. Their first food and beverage venture was tracking towards $5 million in annual revenue. The place was booked, there were literal lines stretching out the door, and the reviews were glowing. People loved the food and the ambiance. And flash forward to a 2022 New York Times review of the restoration hardware restaurants in New York, Gary stated that each of the restaurants at that time were averaging $10 million annually. Now, that's a few years back, so those numbers have likely changed, and they've opened new restaurants since then. But that number seemed wild to me. So at the end of 2015, they launched yet another play, the RH membership program. And so for $100 initially, today it's $200 plus tax, customers could join and get access to a few key perks. You got to work with their in-house interior designers and receive a discount on everything. The in-house designers were a big deal. They helped RH sell complete room concepts instead of just individual pieces of furniture. And the membership discount was clever too. It let them offer price breaks without constantly running promotions that create unpredictable sales patterns. And of course, it also disrupted how traditional interior design worked. And 2015 also marked the debut of RH Modern, a new furniture collection. This launch would prove to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it broadened their catalog and brought in new customer segments. On the other hand, it exposed some serious weaknesses in their operating model that still needed to be worked out. In 2016, their year-over-year revenue grew by just 1%. This revenue drop-off was also accompanied by deteriorating operating margins. And this started to create some fear that RH was potentially a fad and it was starting to lose its it factor. So in 2016, they also acquired Waterworks. And at the time, Gary said that he was proud that RH would now become an authority in two of the most important rooms in the home, the bath and the kitchen. And he also said that he was creating the first fully integrated luxury home platform in the world. And the RH Modern launch created some serious operational headaches. Their product catalog ballooned beyond what their legacy systems could manage. Between all of the new items and the various size and color configurations, they'd added hundreds of new SKUs. This inventory explosion, combined with some promotional missteps, revealed major cracks in their logistics setup. Problem number one, their suppliers weren't ready for the surge in orders. Remember, a lot of these were still small manufacturers doing maybe a couple million in annual revenue. When demand suddenly jumped into the tens of millions, they couldn't keep up. Production bottlenecks led to long wait times and order cancellations. And to prevent things from getting worse, RH delayed shipping the Modern sourcebook by several months, giving vendors more time to ramp up. But that turned out to be overkill because by the end of Q1 2016, they had 90% of the Modern collection back in stock. But the delay was expensive. Management estimated that it cost them roughly $100 million in lost sales, or about 5 percentage points of growth for the year. Meanwhile, their distribution centers were hitting capacity with all of the new inventory, and they were planning to open additional facilities. But here's where things got really messy. The SKU explosion exposed just how inefficient their logistics actually were. When they'd originally built their distribution networks, they'd been told that as long as inventory existed somewhere in the system, the specific location didn't matter. As someone who used to work in Amazon logistics, that is terrible advice, and they found that out too. Their setup was causing products to ping pong around the country unnecessarily. They were burning $9 million annually just moving stuff between distribution centers, a number that would only grow if they kept adding more facilities. So Their fix had two parts. First, reduce the number of distribution centers to better centralize inventory. Fewer facilities meant fewer expensive transfers and less capital locked up in duplicate stock. Second, trim their catalog by cutting older products and poor performers, but that only addressed part of the mess. Their reverse logistics systems handling damaged or returned items was equally broken. These products were bouncing around through multiple stops in a ridiculously wasteful process. A returned couch might sit in a warehouse for weeks until there was enough merchandise to fill a truck to go back to a sorting center. From there, maybe 10 to 20% would go back to a repair facility, then back to a distribution center, potentially get transferred again, maybe go to a store before finally getting sold. Items too damaged for repair would go to yet another facility before ending up at an outlet. One piece of furniture could literally cross the country twice before landing at an outlet to be sold at a massive discount. So the solution was to completely rebuild their reverse logistics. Instead of all of those stops, they started sending returned and damaged goods straight back to the outlet stores. This eliminated the wasteful trips and dramatically reduced how long inventory sat around before being sold. And to make this work, they expanded their outlet footprint from 17 locations in 2015 to 28 in 2016. Once they'd sorted out their logistics nightmare, RH set its sights on moving upmarket. At that point, they saw themselves as occupying the mid-upper tier of the market, but Gary's ambition was to compete with the true luxury powerhouses. Over the next few years, they doubled down on transforming their store portfolio into increasingly grand design galleries while continuing to fine-tune their approach. Interior design services became a core part of the business. At one point, before they stopped reporting this metric, these services were tied to 65% of their sales. That is wild. And this capability really set them apart. Instead of customers just buying individual items, RH could manage the entire project and deliver fully realized rooms and spaces. At the time, they kept expanding their offerings. New collections launched like RH Contemporary, Ski House, Beach House. New business lines emerged, guest house hotels, RH Bathhouse and Spa, RH Residences. They even designed custom Gulfstream jets, RH1 and RH2, that landed in Architectural Digest and became available for charter, which we will talk about along with the yacht of it all. They also started targeting international expansion, which they believe could triple the size of their current operation. Now, with all of these new ventures, plus others, Gary has hinted at things like architectural and landscaping design services and selling completely furnished homes as well. So it's hard to say what RH's final form will look like. But one thing is crystal clear. Gary Friedman is committed to what he calls climbing the luxury mountain and positioning RH alongside giants like Kering, LVMH, and Hermes. However, the jury is still out on whether or not he'll be able to climb this mountain in the way that he's projecting he will. The company did a major share buyback in 2022 and took out variable rate loans to buy back billions worth of the company's stock right before those rates spiked. And then there's the lifestyle ecosystem in Aspen that has been in the works now for close to 5 years with no opening in sight that they've also put $105 million worth of equity investment into. And according to an article in Airmail, many Aspen locals were actively against this major development that RH was proposing, as they felt like the town already was being overrun by billionaires and lots of wealthy people, and this type of development was pushing out the existing community that lived there. And in March of this year, RH actually sold off one of the buildings that they bought in Aspen that they were hoping would be part of this community, because Gary said that the construction costs in Aspen became prohibitive, so they decided to get cash for it instead. And on another note, earlier this year, RH also acquired a few trade-focused brands, Dennison Lean and Formations, for a total of $32 million, funded through available cash. And these companies have different focuses, but per the business of home, that through line is that they tweak antique forms for a modern audience. Admittedly, I had no idea about these companies. I had never heard of them. But when I spoke with some insiders from the industry, I was told that these brands are incredibly high quality, and even the top 1% of designers feel like these brands are some of the most exclusive in the industry. And Gary has stated that these acquisitions are part of the strategy to develop the company's next big aesthetic, as he needs something else to come after the modern and contemporary collections. And You know how I mentioned the foray into art and music earlier? Well, Gary has tried to experiment with different media formats more recently. In 2022, he hired Margaret Russell, and she is the former editor-in-chief of Architectural Digest and Elle Decor, to create RH Media, which was an editorial content platform that was created to celebrate the most innovative and influential people and ideas that are shaping the world of architecture and design. Wow, that was a mouthful, but that is what their press release described it as. And it doesn't look like this has panned out. And per Margaret's LinkedIn, Margaret has moved on from this role after December 2024. So ironically, the RH Media piece is fascinating to me because the company doesn't even have an Instagram or TikTok account, which is really an anomaly in 2025 for a consumer-facing brand. Now in 2025, going to the financial side of things, the company's cash position is dwindling. In part 2 of this RH Deep Dive, we are going to be looking at Gary's choices that have been scrutinized by countless research reports, but haven't really been discussed in mainstream media much. And I have many questions here, and I don't have many of the answers, but I do hope that this deep dive was helpful in understanding the history of the company, where they've been, and where they hope to go. And of course, I'm still leaving out a good amount of detail on this company. I can already envision all of the people who are going to be reaching out to me to say that, oh, you left out this part. And I know, I'm sure I have left out quite a bit, but this business has been around for decades, so there's no way that I could possibly capture every detail. And just as one more disclaimer to end with, anything that I discussed in this episode that is not a pure financial figure from a public document should be taken as my own opinion, not fact. Be on the lookout for next week's episode, where we will go into greater detail on a handful of topics, including the lawsuit between RH and their competitor, the 2 private jets and massive yacht of it all, and some more tidbits that I think you'll find interesting. If you enjoyed this episode, you will definitely want to tune into the next one. So thanks for listening, and see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. I've been wanting to launch this show for so long. I can't tell you how excited I am to do this and how thrilled I am that you're actually here listening. It means the world to me. If you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast because it massively helps to support the work I do to bring the show to life. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammi Cohen Talks and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, which is linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammi Cohen. Social Currency is produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.